Thanks very much, Ian, and welcome to everyone to this session today, which is a joint session of the Grand Bargain Participation Revolution Workstream and the Interagency Standing Committee Task Force on Accountability to Affected Populations. And the title of our session today is Joining Forces for Greater Accountability to People Affected by Crisis. My name is Manisha Thomas. I'm a consultant who will be moderating the session today. And it is my pleasure to invite you all here in the second conversation that we're having of the Interagency Standing Committee Task Force on AAP. But that first session that we had back in June as a side event during the ECOSOC humanitarian segment was actually building upon numerous other conversations that had taken place with its predecessor, the Interagency Standing Committee Results Group on AAP and protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. So today's session is yet another one in a longer conversation around AAP. Before I just update us a little bit on what's happened previously, I did want to just open up the Slido poll so that while I'm talking, you can all put in some answers for our first poll, because we do want to make sure that we're getting inputs from all of you in the audience today. So our first question is, if you are engaged in collective efforts around AAP, what is working well? And here we've got a word cloud, and we're going to ask you to kind of put that into 3 words with 2 possible answers. And then once you've sent that, we have a second question on what is the main obstacle preventing you from engaging in collective efforts around AAP. And here we're just going to ask you for 1 obstacle. And I say that partly, and I'll let you work on those while I'm updating you on the rest of things. When we did the session back in June at the side event on ECOSOC, we had sent out in advance asking people to tell us about the different barriers they were experiencing in terms of collective action around AAP. And we got over 700 answers, I think, lots and lots of different elements that came out there. There were things around lack of funding, a lack of the complexity, commitments that people have, the mindset that we've got within organizations, the systems not being able to meaningfully prioritize AAP. Time constraints were another big barrier that people identified. Not listening to people that have been affected by crises also came up a lot. Also, this kind of issues around xenophobia came out, inequality, numerous barriers came out. So we want to hear from those of you here today, what are some of the things that you're hearing or that you're seeing as barriers? What we have seen through the different events leading up to today, I think, is just important to kind of remind us of what we've discussed previously so that we can continue to build on those conversations. The ISC events that took place with Results Group 2, I believe it was, on AAP and PSEA, a number of elements came out there where there are lots of challenges still about genuinely putting people at the center of our responses. Organizations are not necessarily prioritizing that in the same way. So what is it that we can do to have a more consistent approach across organizations so that we can collectively put our ambitions around accountability to affected populations into practice? Also, what are some of the ways that we can really ensure that we've got the voices of affected populations and affected people at decision-making tables? And this is definitely one of the issues that the current task force in the ISC is looking at, but also the Grand Bargain Participation Revolution was really looking very much at, how do we make sure that we have people that are affected by crisis making the decisions that affect their lives? And just as a reminder for those, the Grand Bargain that was adopted between donors and aid agencies at the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016 had as its 6th commitment a participation revolution, include people receiving aid in making the decisions which affect their lives. And that included improving leadership and governance mechanisms at country level, but also developing common standards and a coordinated approach, more funding that's flexible, investing time and resources, And so we'll be looking at that a little bit today as well, in terms of how that Grand Bargain Participation Revolution workstream is also working on the AAP elements. Other things that have come out, we've also heard that we need to have more empowerment of local structures that make processes around accountability more accessible and inclusive. We're still finding that we're not doing that consistently. When we're putting in place mechanisms, we're not always consulting communities to put in place the best feedback and complaints mechanisms in consultations with communities. So how can we do that? It's also very clearly come out that leadership and strong leadership and a commitment to AAP is essential if we're going to make it really work. And there's also been this call that, we need to make sure that we're not just looking at this as a checkbox, especially from the donor perspective, where in a proposal, it may be that, yes, are you doing things around AAP? Yes, but then are we really taking that seriously? Are there conversations happening between funders and implementers around how do we really put AAP into practice? And that's come out in a few conversations that we've had as well about, what is it when it comes, how honest can we be about those conversations? Can we change programs midstream? Do we want to change some of the projects? And how do we make sure that we are really being able to have those honest conversations, particularly given the different power dynamics that will exist between donors and funders, and also between international and national and local organizations? So some of those elements also came out. And then particularly in the last session that we had back in June, we really had some elements come out around, we're not really putting people at the center adequately enough. We're too often seeing them as quote unquote beneficiaries instead of really taking the effort to identify those who may be harder to reach, that may not be the ones that are constantly coming to the table. So really looking at how can we be more inclusive of communities that are affected and populations and people that are affected by crisis, and making sure that they're there. As I mentioned before, leadership really making that commitment, having a much more system-wide approach to accountability to affected populations is critical to having that more collective approach. And so today we're going to be picking up on a lot of those conversations and themes that we've been discussing in the previous events. And it's my pleasure today to be joined by a great big panel. We're actually going to split the session into two panels. So the first one, we're going to be hearing some of the more practical elements from implementers that are doing things on the ground. And on that first panel, we've got Meg Sattler from Ground Truth Solutions and Nanette from EcoWeb. And then our third speaker, Mahir Bhatt, unfortunately couldn't join us due to an extreme family emergency. So he sends his apologies, but will be joining us in future events. And then our second panel, we have the co-chairs of the Grand Bargain Participation Revolution workstream, David from the US government and Gareth from the Steering Committee on Humanitarian Response, as well as the co-chairs, two of the three co-chairs of the ISC Task Force on AAP. We've got Tanya Wood from CHS Alliance and Jesse Wood from the World Food Program. And we've also got Frank, who's with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, joining us from the audience. So before I move into the first panel, and I will introduce our speakers in a little bit more detail when we get to the panels, I'm going to just take a quick look at the Slidos, if we could, just to see what it is that you have all told us in terms of the collective, what's working well. So commitment is coming out as really being one of the strongest elements there, which undeniably seems to be the biggest one. Then we've got things about power change, sharing tools, sharing reports, local drive, quality, do no harm, confident leadership, community ownership, learning and adaptation, commitment and leadership. So a lot of elements there, but I think that commitment to the collective efforts working well is really coming across very strongly. If we could then turn to the second one around the main obstacle. It seems we don't have any obstacles, either that or I didn't get to that second question. I'm not sure how that works. So maybe what we can do is let you put in what you see as the main obstacle preventing for you from engaging in collective efforts, and we'll revisit that one. So maybe, if I can get you to maybe leave that one and we'll move to the panel first. So this first panel that we've got, as I mentioned, we're really going to be looking at sort of what's happening on the ground. And throughout the conversation today, we're really going to be focusing on three broad questions. And we would love to hear your perspectives from the audience also on what you think the answers are to those questions. And our first question is, what would encourage greater coordination across the humanitarian system to achieve more effective collective action on AAP? And what are the remaining blockages to such action and how can they be removed? How can donors better support the drive for greater accountability to affected people across the system and with key partners and provide coordinated advocacy to overcome those blockages to effective collective action? And then how can we ensure that the voices of affected people and communities themselves are meaningfully integrated into decision-making processes? And so on this first panel, as I mentioned, we've got Meg Sattler, who is the CEO of Ground Truth Solutions, and also sits on the board of the CHS Alliance. She's been a vocal advocate for aid that sees people at the center and has made significant contributions to accountability over the past 15 years and has worked in a range of different organizations, including the UN and in different countries. And I think, Meg, that point around really putting people at the center is something that we're still struggling with. So look forward to your inputs here today. And then we've also got Nanette. Regina is her full name, Salvador Antequisa, who is the executive director of EcoWeb in the Philippines. And she's got over 30 years of humanitarian and development experience and has been actively involved in advocacy for localization of aid. And she's also a governing member of Loop and is also on the coordination group of Charter for Change and in different CSO networks in the Philippines. So welcome to both of you today, and I really appreciate you being here. So maybe I can turn to you, Meg, first. Ground Truth Solutions has been doing some work recently looking at how accountability to affected people is faring from people's perspectives and what implications that has for global policy. So based on that, and particularly given your drive for putting people at the center, what have you seen as some of the remaining blockages to more effective collective action? And what's worked to ensure greater coordination on AAP?
Thank you so much, Manisha, and thanks to everyone for having me on this very timely and important panel. It was nice today to see Martin Griffiths sharing the accountability report from the CHS Alliance. So I think it's clear that commitments are sort of at an all-time high. The question is a complex one, so I'll do my best to answer it. I think most people are probably familiar with Ground Truth Solutions, but we've been tracking perceptions of people living in crisis for about 10 years now. We just quietly celebrated our 10th birthday. I don't have time in a couple of minutes to go through the sort of millions of data points that we've collected, but we've learned a couple of things along the way that are quite, I guess, pertinent to this topic. So I'll share a couple of those. One of them is that there are consistently two big gaps when it comes to sort of people at the center. One is between how humanitarians and affected people tend to see things, tend to sort of view how aid is working, with humanitarians tending to have a slightly rosier view of things. And two is this gap between people's expectations of the system and their realities of how they actually experience it. And that's something that we've been delving into a bit more recently in our more recent research. We used to sort of ask people how they experienced humanitarian action. We're now adding more inquiry that focuses on what they actually expect of humanitarians in the first place. And what we find is that there's a fairly big gap in most places between expectation and reality on most of the metrics that we deem to be important as a sector when it comes to the accountability discussion. Now, to address those things is a little bit harder. I think we're all sort of aware of that problem statement. But one thing that we've learned the hard way is that a lot of the current approaches when it comes to collective action are definitely not enough. And that's not to say that they're not good. Some of them are really excellent, but at the collective level, they're not enough. An example from us in our little corner of the world is that we had hoped initially, I think, that data would be enough. If we had this really clear evidence that things weren't working, maybe there would be really system-wide action on that data. Similarly, when it comes to activities, there's a lot of great things that are going on, but they're just not having that sort of collective impact. And that's not really from our view because there is not a will to coordinate or because things aren't coming together in the right way. That's part of it, but it's mainly because this topic is not so much about activities, but it's about power. Activities that are great are happening at the program level, at local level. I'm glad that Nanette is here because she always has countless examples of really excellent approaches when it comes to accountability, but they don't add up to more than the sum of their parts because of systemic barriers. The accountability report that was released today, I think, have a look through that because that's another great example of how much effort agencies are putting in when it comes to accountability. But at some point, those efforts really hit a ceiling when it comes to broader outcomes. It's like all these activities and actors and very committed people are doing their best, but they hit a ceiling at some point where banding together and sharing ideas and coordinating just isn't enough to sort of get to that next level. We have a few hypotheses, I think, as to why that is based on our own experience. But I think when we're talking about collective action, unless we really recognise the fact that the system itself needs a bit of a shake-up, we're going to stay stuck at that wrong level. We do a lot of work, obviously, collecting data, discussing it with communities, gathering recommendations, hosting dialogue sessions, but we always discuss our data with country teams and decision makers in country. And we tend to come up against three quite common excuses or maybe reasons, to use a more polite word, as to why at the collective level decision makers can't act on community preferences and feedback and priorities and input. The first being that the system doesn't have enough money. And I think that's true. If you look at humanitarian responses, most of them are not funded up to about 50%. So that's a very easy excuse. The other one that's quite common is people say if you engage communities too much, the things that they want or prefer or need are actually not things that the humanitarian system is mandated to provide because people really want longer term solutions. We find that in our research almost every time. And I think in a very simplistic way, you could agree with that excuse, but then it's interesting that we have so much policy now on the nexus and on durable solutions, area-based programming, resilience. So it's a little bit hard to sort of dismiss community feedback for that reason. And the third part is inflexibility. So people usually say, we've done our best to sort of involve communities, but we can't because donors are not flexible or management systems like the humanitarian program cycle are not flexible. And I think those are things that we really need to address if we're ever going to really be able to take this collective accountability question seriously. So to me, it's not so much about burning the whole system down, which I know is sometimes a common refrain, but just about putting more doors in it to make it a bit more malleable and a bit more open. One thing that we've seen that has worked at least a bit at the collective level has been just examples of creative leadership, people who sort of gather around a single problem, tackle one problem at a time, humanitarian coordinators not necessarily doing things by the book, but thinking, how do I sort of understand this response? How do we make sure that we're a bit more responsive to communities? We saw this concretely a few years back in Chad, where the country team invited us to come in with a real commitment to listen to what communities were saying and discuss that in the right places. We've seen it in the Central African Republic. We've all seen it, I think, quite recently in Syria. So I think we sort of collectively put a lot of effort into systems and processes, but maybe what we need a bit more of is a nice combination of messier systems of participation, a little bit of letting go of power, and also a few maybe rebels and rule breakers at the top. And just to finish on that point, I think we get a little bit stuck in process in the accountability world. And I think that for a while that was really needed. But I think we're lacking sometimes a bit of imagination and the fact that things can really be done differently if there's a will to do them differently. It struck me that there was this great article today in the New Humanitarian about different ways that individuals and groups are doing things differently to decolonize aid. And it just got me thinking that we don't really have a similar list like that on accountability of really tangible things that have happened at the systemic level to try and take this discussion to a new level. I think we're all very busy trying to advocate for enough permission to even sort of diligently roll out the mechanisms and activities and advice that we kind of have already. So I'll stop there. That was a little bit of a stream of consciousness, but I'm looking forward to hearing from the other speakers.
Thanks very much, Megan. I think you laid out a lot of really important issues there that I think we can talk more on. But before I just come back on that, I would encourage you to use the chat, please, in the audience. If you do have comments or questions, and Catherine from CHS Alliance has kindly put those 3 big questions into the chat. So we'd love to hear some of your views on that. And I will come back to the second Slido question before we move to the next panel. But I think, Meg, those points around, that creative leadership and those kind of 3 areas that you get that pushback from in terms of, not enough money, it's not in our mandate as humanitarians, and that inflexibility in our systems really kind of brings us back to the importance of leadership. And as you said, when you've got that creative leadership, you can see that things work in different ways. And I think if we're moving towards that collective approach, how can we do that in more creative ways? Nanette, perhaps I can turn to you and, from your perspective as a leader in the Philippines, also working with Loop, which has a different approach or is a similar sort of approach like Ground Truth Solutions, really listening to people. Would you agree with what Meg's raised, in terms of some of those challenges and what's working well? And are there other incentives for greater coordination that you would identify, or any other obstacles that you would add to the conversation? And also in that sense, what role do you think donors could play in terms of some coordinated advocacy to overcome those obstacles?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Manisha, thank you, Meg, for that very insightful sharing. But before I start, I just would like to also express my solidarity to all affected of disasters and crises, including those just recently affected of the super typhoon Noro, just passed through the Philippines, and left thousands of families now displaced and affected. Yes, Manisha. I totally agree with the views and sharing of Meg. It really resonates what I see. It's a reality on the ground in the Philippines. I agree. Collective action is not truly enough, and there's a truly big gap between expectations and reality. And yes, I truly see this as a power dynamics, system barrier, and there is so much inflexibility in the system in terms of power. The non-commitment, and also the no openness, for letting go of that power that actually enabled the disabled participation of people affected of crises. And of course, with that, we really need that reimagination of aid if we really would like this system to work for people affected of crises. And certainly, yes, I see greater coordination could provide incentive, especially for affected people, if the sector can just do greater coordination in action. But in order for greater coordination to really add value, it should also result to a more cost-effective and more efficient way of addressing the needs of the affected people. And it should result to greater resource allocation for direct actions benefiting the affected people. And it should result to cost-effective management of resources from unnecessary redundant actions like conduct of multiple assessments and even duplication of response actions. Greater coordination should also result to well distribution of resources and more effective coverage, so no one is left behind, as what we are saying in the humanitarian sector. But I would like to borrow the words of the affected population in many of our discussion. I were always hearing this: nothing about us without us. Effective coordination would also require, of course, voices of the affected are heard. And it should result to greater accountability, not only to donors, but especially to the affected population. For we could certainly maximize the limited resources in every crisis situation if the people are made part of the solution and made part of the decision-making process. Well, for example, I'd like to share for EcoWeb with our network ClearNet and other partners who are really advocates for accountability and localization. We collectively promote, for example, in the Philippines, community-led approaches where people lead the process and the decision-making of their actions, well, based on their priority needs. And with the stronger coordination and cooperation, we're able to effectively facilitate local leadership of humanitarian and resilience actions. By applying this approach, and I would like to share, we are able to allocate, and for us, we are proud of this, because of this approach, we're able to allocate not less than 70% of our project funds for direct actions, and not less than 60% of our funds for microcash grants to community-led collective actions. And thus, we are showing actually how we can become more accountable to the funds that we are raising in the name of the affected population. But just like to note, though, that we were able to start scaling up this approach through the support mainly from the philanthropists and corporate foundations. With network of CSOs in the Philippines, we also advocate for collective accountability, as mentioned, through Talk to Loop, the digital feedbacking platform, which I am part of as a governing board member. Wherein the affected people and local actors and everyone can freely access through SMS text messaging, calls, or Wi-Fi, where anyone can just express their views, share experiences, and provide recommendations on certain issues, on the response actions, or even to inactions to the crises and vulnerabilities that people are facing. Through Talk to Loop, we could hear anytime more direct feedback from the ground by making digital technology serving the need of the people. Feedback received also serve as basis in our planning and programming, and Talk to Loop as a collective accountability mechanism provides an open and safe platform to everyone. By promoting this platform, we are also able to demonstrate, especially to our community partners, that we are serious in our commitment to accountability. However, while community-led approaches, strengthening local coordination, Talk to Loop, among others, demonstration of concrete actions to accountability, but I would say in reality, they remain least supported by major donors, UN and NGOs. And of course, certainly, I could say donors can do more. As mentioned, we need more commitment turned into action, more flexibility, and more accountability. And we need actually the trust, trust on the capacity of the local actors. Thank you. Back to you, Manisha.
Thanks very much, Meg. And I think, and thank you also for reminding us of those who were affected by the recent disaster in the Philippines. And I'm sure that your organization and many others are doing a lot of work to respond to that. But I think it's also a reminder that there's constantly numerous disasters and conflicts happening where people are being affected on a daily basis, unfortunately. I mean, I think that's some of those ways that you've been able to really sort of scale up your approaches and really become more cost effective and really working towards making sure that no one is left behind is incredibly important. And there's a suggestion in the chat from someone saying I guess one of the turning upside down moments would be to let's make the aid industry voluntary, i.e. unpaid based on a strong network force as in the local communities, and then see who stays and cares. I mean, to be very fair, there's a lot of volunteers already who are doing a huge amount of the work that we see now. In that sense, I mean, really thinking about the way that both of you have sort of talked about, we need that greater coordination and that greater collaboration to be able to work more collectively together, and we'll be able to get there a bit better. From your perspectives, what do we need to be doing to ensure that we're really meaningfully integrating the voices of those who are affected into decision-making processes, whether it's at the country level or at the global level? And what should organizations or donors be doing to really support that meaningful inclusion of their voices? Meg, maybe I can turn to you for your thoughts, and then to you, Nanette.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the things that I would say Nanette has already said more eloquently than I would. But I think at the country level, it's definitely a combination of things. I think, this creative leadership point is very important to me personally, just because I've seen the sort of potential for change that has. And when I say creative leadership, often it means pushing back on some of the bureaucracy that we've become so good at. Flexible funds is obviously an obvious one. But I think to sort of touch on Nanette's points a bit, I think proper local representation and leadership and trust, which was really the right word. I think Ukraine really, for me, made that case incredibly strongly, seeing the way that a lot of the sort of biggest agencies in Ukraine often didn't even know who they were working with by way of an affected population, and those people and agencies and actors and non-traditional actors, or whatever you want to call them, who were really sort of doing the bulk of the work, didn't have much power at all when it came to the humanitarian system, both in sort of funding and decision making, and also in recognition. And so I think to support that, we do need a bit of a higher risk appetite when it comes to some of the global to local funds transfer and engagement. And maybe this sounds a bit counter to that, I don't know, and maybe it's controversial, but I do still believe in some kind of audit style function that highlights community views over the rollout of activities when it comes to monitoring whether things are working or not. GTS is obviously one element of that, so I don't know if this sounds a bit self-serving, but I think what's missing even in the work that we do is the impetus for anyone to act on what people say. That should be a part of any HCT meeting. It should feature much more prominently in the performance management of humanitarian leaders. And I think there are a few sort of small tangible ways that could be brought to the fore a bit more. Similarly, at the global level, I think we need to get a bit more real about monitoring and reporting. There's a lot of window dressing, I think, at the moment when it comes to accountability, people who can sort of quite easily say that they've got plans or structures or mechanisms in place, but no real incentive to find out or to report on what that means for the experience of affected people. I think also it's interesting to see Yagana in the chat, because she had a great tweet today, which was about stopping trying to be so perfectionist in the way that we sort of tackle this issue, given how messy the system is, and how much it would involve a real sort of relinquishing of power if true accountability were ever to really work. At the broader level, I think, there's a bigger question about, can we ever really be accountable with this monopolised funding system where big agencies get most of the money and really the least is demanded of them when it comes to demonstrating whether or not people are at the centre. I think at the global level, that's where some of the big systemic shifts need to happen. And then I think donors, sometimes there's this quite easy crack at donors that says they're not flexible. We discussed this a little bit in the Grand Bargain meeting last week, but I think some of them are more flexible than they're given credit for. And maybe need to be a bit more vocal about that. If they're not, then they should be. But perhaps also demanding flexibility also from grantees rather than simply allowing it would go a really long way. And finally, in terms of funding sort of accountability activities themselves, I think it's quite important now to steer away from sort of gadget-based approaches to accountability and really look for those more systemic opportunities for change. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Meg. And I think it's interesting also, we've got in the chat there, talking about the flexibility of donors, if they could include a community planning period in proposals. And that would, on the one hand, allow organizations to take time for co-planning with communities, and on the other hand, serve to the donor communities, that communities are integrated structurally. So I think that really bringing that into that project cycle. And I think, Meg, you mentioned that earlier in terms of, some of those systems that we have in the bureaucracy also, Nanette, that you mentioned, that we've put in place all these systems, but how do we make sure that they're flexible enough so that we're really able to engage communities and bring them to the decision-making tables is also critical. Sorry. Nanette, from your perspective, what would be ways that we should be or could be doing better at really bringing in those the voices of affected people into decision-making processes at country level or the global level? And there's a question in here also around that said, your intervention was highlighting the potentially useful links between the conversation that we're having here and recent work on meaningful refugee participation, both through the work of refugee-led organizations in diverse contexts and the participation of refugees in the governance of the global refugee regime. And so the question there is also, how can we better learn from progress in the refugee space to inform practical steps to greater accountability in the broader humanitarian space? But Nanette, some of your thoughts on those questions, please.
Yeah, thank you, Manisha, and also for that question. As I shared earlier, and there are already these practices, that ensure that voices of the affected people and communities are meaningfully integrated in the decision-making processes. And as I've mentioned, this already happening in the Philippines and in other countries as well. But it has not scaled up yet to the level that I'd like to make use of the word by Marvin in the earlier, like turning upside down the sector, where we can really have the base, the people affected, really giving them power and making them also at the center. As I said, community-led approaches, Talk to Loop are just among those, like a platform and mechanisms. And they are already happening. It's not only in the Philippines, and we have this community of practice already, like with the global protection, showing actually that people really can do better in planning, in decision making, and really could, if they are given the liberty and also the agency to decide for themselves, manage and plan, implement and monitor, they act. Like even how limited our resources are, it could actually do more effective impact and more impact to the lives of the people. And this is already happening, and we can see a lot already of stories in Kenya, South Sudan, in Palestine, in Myanmar, Haiti, Colombia, and Zimbabwe. And it is actually a growing and expanding, although, as I've said, sadly, the scaling up of this practice is really, as the moment, still very heavily dependent on those trusting and supportive philanthropist funding, corporate funding that we have access, a little still, from the traditional humanitarian agencies. Talk to Look also, as a platform, it's actually providing a very promising collective accountability mechanism, and it is being implemented now in cooperation with national NGOs and networks in Zambia, Somalia, Indonesia, and in Ukraine. And it is ambition to serve more and widely used by the humanitarian and development sector as a collective accountability mechanism where people are provided free digital platform for safe feedbacking and reporting issues that need responses by service, humanitarian, and development organizations and agencies, including the government. And we have actually tried that in the Philippines already, starting to promote that in the government system as well. It can also be used for sharing of experiences by people and communities to inform planning and programming. But as we have already demonstrated this, and there are already a lot, but of course we can only make things scale this up further if we have more support and we have more trust from donors, from more power holders in the sector, in flexibility of more flexible funding, and trusting that locals have the capacity and community can actually lead the process. As I said, refugees, yes, of course, IDPs in the Philippines, not really refugees from our countries, but we have demonstrated that. But certainly refugees can really do better in responding to the crisis if they are enabled and supported to lead the process. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nanette. And I think that point you made really about, building that, getting that trust, because we do have good examples out there, and yet we're not able to really scale those up. And I think we've talked about best practices, good practices, and in some of the previous sessions, we've seen a lot of great examples of what's really working well. So in that sense, what is it that's preventing that trust being put into local actors, if I can ask, and why is it that it's the more corporate foundations or the philanthropists that are putting money into some of the efforts that you've spoken about, Nanette? What do we need to do to get the bigger donors and the bigger system to really buy into it? Nanette, I'm going to see if you've got a thought on that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, for me, while I see actually, this systems, policies in place is really quite inflexible. But I really believe, the system is still run by people. And of course, if we really would like to change the system, then the people running it should have a change in mindset. And so practice will follow. But of course, change in practice, and it also needs commitment. And if we really believe in this, commitment to localization, accountability to affected population, it should not just be in words, but leaders, those holding the power, should really do more, making their intermediary partners become more accountable, having that in the system, having that in agreements, for example, to be concrete. And but what we have experienced is accessing this funding with all those systems, requirements, and policies. It's just not that friendly really to this more for participatory and locally led action. And we have really experienced a lot of obstacles in that. And unless donors would change their mindset and their systems and policies and become more flexible, for example, then we can do better.
Thanks very much, Nanette. And Meg, I think there's a few comments in here also in the chat. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat at the same time, around this need to really get donors to be more flexible. And, you had mentioned that when you're talking about what some of the findings are that Ground Truth has at the country level, you get a bit of pushback around the inflexibilities of donors and the systems that we have. Are there suggestions? And then you said also, you've got that creative leadership that sometimes pushes outside of the book. Do you see that with some of the donors, or what have been some of the incentives or the pushes that have helped to make donors more flexible? Because as you mentioned, not all donors are inflexible. What is it that has sold them on being more flexible, and how can we get that to become more part of the advocacy collectively to other donors?
Yeah, it's a good question, and not one that I'm sure I have a highly intelligent answer to. But I think, we have seen in certain cases that we have many conversations like this where we then go to donors and say, according to anyone who's anyone in this response, it's your fault. You're the reason why nothing is flexible in this response. And normally they come back to us with quite tangible examples of, here is an agreement that we have that is multi-year, and within this, if it's not sector-based, there is, quite a lot of room for flexibility as long as there's constant communication. And I'm not saying that's always the case, but I'm just saying it's more often the case than I think people give donors credit for. But I think underpinning that is a discussion that I was in the other day, which got a little bit heated, was a discussion about accountability is for whom. And I think we're still in this kind of mode where we think accountability is either to affected people or to donors. And when we're talking about donors, they have their own accountabilities, if they're institutional government donors, to their kind of taxpayers. And so that's where I think a lot of the issues underpinning these crazy due diligence systems kind of come in. And so I think I don't have, sadly, an answer to that, but I think if we're able to better marry the idea that accountability to affected people is actually also accountability to taxpayers, then I feel like we may have more opportunities to not rely so much on sort of private philanthropy, that's hard to say in a hurry, type donors, and actually sort of have some of that flexibility and responsiveness a bit more sort of mainstreamed across responses, given how prolific these institutional donors are. That's not easy, and I'm sorry that I don't have huge answers to that, but I think it's a real challenge to all of us.
I think, Meg, though, that point you made around how a lot of donor agreements will have a lot of flexibility built into them, but we don't necessarily take advantage of them, is something that's come up. At the same time, there's also been the conversation about, the power imbalance that you do have, because if you do raise that with a donor, is it always easy for that to be taken up? Do you feel that that may risk further funding in the future? And I think, having, somebody had also mentioned in the chat, amplifying the voices of local and national NGOs to the intermediaries collectively for the design phase before kicking off the project is important as well. And the financing that's needed for the design team at the organization level for local and national NGOs. I think there's often this power differential that we don't necessarily always acknowledge or really have figured out how to manage it. And in a conversation about a pooled fund last week, a local organization on the advisory group was kind of in contradiction with somebody on the pooled fund, but felt in a position where they couldn't really push for the change that they wanted or the funding they wanted because of the potential implications that could have for future funding. And I guess there's a question, it's a huge question, how do we address those power imbalances so that even when we get local and national organizations at the table, or we get affected communities or people at the table, there's going to be a power dynamic there. How do we manage that power dynamic so that their voices are heard and taken as seriously as, some of the big organizations or the big donors? Just a small, easy question, Nanette. Maybe I'll turn it to you for a few thoughts on that, and then Meg, and then I'll wrap up this part of the panel session and then move to the next panel. And maybe also if you have any last words, Nanette and Meg, after that.
It is really a framework. No? It's a frame of mind. So for us who are doing this already, making people do the decisions and for their action, for we believe that they know better. There's of their need. It's not only about their needs, but they know also what are their capacity. And we just then, we had, actually it's a process. No, we started really just more than 5 years ago, about 6 years ago when we started this. And when I saw actually the impact, the change, I said, this is the approach that we have been looking for. As a development organization, we are not only a humanitarian, but also a development organization. The Nexus approach, we are already doing that. And we see actually that we do better the Nexus approach, development and humanitarian, when we let the people lead the process, do the decision-making process, do the planning. And there is already a how actually on how to do that, but it's really more of, are you willing to implement that change in your system, in your practice? So it's really like a change of mindset. And it is actually like a change, like starting from one organization to our, but that should not only be like staying at the local, but we are actually challenging those who are holding power at the global level, the donors, the UN, and the INGOs. Then we can actually do more in changing the system, making the people at the center of the aid. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nanette. And I think that change in mindset is so critical indeed. Meg, some thoughts from you on those. How do we really get those changes to happen? And also any last thoughts before I wrap up this panel?
Yeah, I wish I knew how to get those changes. I think though one thing that, we are trying to look at a bit more as ground truth is trying to find more of that evidence, even if it feels minor, of examples of things that are working at that more sort of systems level. And we're working on various methodologies to potentially help us do that. I've spoken a little bit to Gareth about this, about how I get a little bit depressed working at Ground Truth and sort of always having to share quite negative examples of things without being able to back that up with really sort of tangible examples of what can work. So I'm hoping that next time we gather together, we might have a little bit more sort of positive evidence of things that we might be able to scale. But I think to me, the key theme from this discussion, and big thanks to Nanette for sort of cementing this also in my mind, is this trust deficit. And I think looking at that, you know, there's a trust deficit when it comes to listening to affected people directly, also when it comes to listening to national and local responders. And I think that's sort of the heart of what we need to tackle more than some of these sort of smaller mechanism type problems. So I'll leave it there, but hoping that we are able to get together with a few more positive examples next time.
Thanks very much, Meg. And I think the two of you have really sort of laid out a lot of what is working well and how we really need to be identifying how do we move forward? How do we scale that up? If we really are putting the trust, as you put it, Nanette, in what communities are identifying as their needs and their capacities, we'll be much better at overcoming some of those obstacles that we're seeing and really be able to scale up some of those efforts that are working well. I think, you know, the points around the system not being flexible, or that we need to find ways of having more flexibility in the system, are really critical. And I think identifying how to move past a lot of that bureaucracy and process we've put in place and really start to look at how do we bring people to the table? How do we listen to them more seriously and involve them from the very beginning so that we're designing programs with them? But then we're also looking at what are their capacities so that we're not duplicating things and we're not bringing in extra elements that we don't need to, because those capacities are already in the community, is critical. And I think that shifting of, you know, as you put it, in that really becoming much more, you know, friendly so that the systems are more accessible to local actors and local communities is also really critical there. And I think finding ways to get that creative leadership, as you put it, Meg, so that we're trying to find systems that work better for putting people at the center as opposed to our systems is really critical. So I think you've both, and thank you very much for that, have put a number of great ideas on the table, which then can lead us into our second panel, where we're going to be looking much more at the global level and what are some of the policy changes that can be made to support some of those changes that have been identified as being necessary. Before we do that, I'm going to just take a quick look at our Slido. So thank you again, Nanette and Meg, and we'll maybe come back to you if there's time. But our second Slido question that we had originally, if we could put that up, in terms of, thank you, what is the main obstacle preventing you from engaging in collective effort? So time and funding are definitely the biggest ones. Lack of a harmonized approach, duplication, more coordination, prioritization of AAP, but also things around participation of communities, overcomplication, different cultures, lack of trust came out again, the fear of the donor response, culture, multiple needs, I think echoes a lot of what Meg, you and Nanette have raised in that first panel, as well as what we've heard in many of the other ones around those elements around prioritization, funding, and time. Thank you, Ian. So with that, I am going to actually see if we can put up our second Slido poll so that we can kind of move away from what are those obstacles and challenges you're facing. And we would love to hear from you in the audience what one key action is that you would recommend to encourage more joint action on AAP. So what's the one thing that you think we should be doing? And I'll leave that Slido up for you to answer. And then I will introduce briefly our second panel. As I mentioned, we have co-chairs from the Grand Bargain Participation Revolution, as well as co-chairs from the IASC Task Force on AAP. Jesse, I hope that we can get you up here. Thank you, Tanya, for that reminder. I see that Jesse's not in here, so hopefully we can get Jesse back on the main stage here. Wonderful, Jesse's here. So I'm going to introduce our panel. As I mentioned before, we've got David Giovanna, who is a 30-year veteran of the U.S. Foreign Service and has worked in a number of consular and diplomatic assignments on 3 continents. And since retiring in 2018, he's become a policy advisor, for the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, focused on coordination, protection, and AAP. But David is here representing the U.S. government as co-chair of the Grand Bargain Participation Revolution workstream. And then the other co-chair of that workstream is Gareth Price-Jones, who's the executive secretary of the Steering Committee on Humanitarian Response, who supports the principles of that network in driving forward the Steering Committee's vision and goals. Gareth has over 15 years frontline experience as a country director with several NGOs and is been working on various issues prior to one of these, which is now the co-convening of the Participation Revolution workstream. And on the ISC task force side, we have Jesse Wood, who, as in addition to being the co-chair, is the Chief of Emergencies and Transitions in the World Food Programme's Policy and Program Department, which establishes normative frameworks and operational standards for WFP. That also focuses on protection and AP. And previously, Jesse worked in WFP operations in South Sudan and in regional areas, and also worked in the Canadian government on UN reform. And then we've got Tanya, last but not least, Tanya Wood, the Executive Director of the CHS Alliance, who many of you in the audience will know. Tanya and I used to work together many years ago at the International Council of Voluntary Agencies. And prior to that, Tanya worked also with the Red Cross, International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in numerous roles in different countries. I don't have a bio for you, Tanya, so that's what I'm going from memory on. So this panel really is, we've heard a lot of challenges coming from the country level and the implementation that we're seeing from affected people, what they've been saying, what some of the challenges are there that they're facing. So picking up on that, and I'm going to turn to you first, David and Gareth, in terms of some of the opportunities and obstacles you heard from Meg and Nanette, as well as in the chat, and the roles that were kind of identified for donors, what do you think the Participation Revolution workstream could do to contribute more to joint action on AAP?
Do you want to go first, David?
Okay, I was going to defer, but yes. First of all, thank you for inviting us. I think this is an important, critical moment in this discussion, and it's really, as the task force is stepping up and the work stream and the Grand Bargain may be sort of moving toward its end state, this is a moment of transition. I agree with almost everything that was said in panel one. Of course, I talked to Meg a fair bit, and I've always agreed with her. And I think her point on imagination is really important. And we get our heads away from the process questions and the nuts and bolts of this and really think more creatively. And it seems to me that there are three pillars of work that we need to sort of focus on. And the donors have a critical role to play in this. First is the leadership question. I think that's absolutely critically important. If people will step up and actually lead and think creatively, that's really important. I'm kind of struck, I was more optimistic a couple of months ago or a year ago, but I've been in conversations with many of our partners over the past 6 months in which I sit in on a briefing in which they're telling us everything they're doing in response A, response B, and we often get to the end and I raise my hand and say, and what are you actually doing on accountability to affected persons, and how are you engaging with communities? And then they'll say, oh yeah, we're doing X, Y, and Z, but it never comes up in the initial briefing. It never comes up on the top priorities that they want to convey to us. I have to often remind them to do that. And I think that is a critical lesson. So leadership is important. Second, communication is important. I think this is where donors have not been as proactive as we could be. The most important thing I think donors can do is to listen. But we can also ask, as I said, if we get these briefings, if we engage with our partners at the field, at the headquarters level, and we never ask about AAP, then we're not going to get told about AAP. And so that's an important guiding to the conversation. We also, I think, need to communicate among ourselves. If we donors, and this is where I think the Participation Revolution Workstream has a role, and we are prioritizing this over the next year, if we are communicating better among ourselves, if we are putting forward common advocacy, if we are putting forward common messaging to key actors such as humanitarian country teams, such as frontline workers, such as HCs, when we're in the field, when we're in headquarters, if we have agreed on aligned requirements, and I think we are pretty aligned, but the common advocacy, I think that will go a long way. And finally, a very quick note on funding. I really was struck by what Nanette said about it's the philanthropists, it's the private sector that are taking the lead in funding these. I think there are a lot of reasons for that, why governments perhaps have been slow to do this, but I don't think that's a bad thing. And I think one of the things that's come to my mind as we talk as a system about decolonization and decentralization is that we need to find more sources of funding outside the standard government funding. And that is a good thing. And that should include resource mobilization in the global South, not just in the global North, under the idea, as we've always said, that money equals power. Money follows power. And if money is coming from the global South more than it is now, in addition to not replacing what's coming from the traditional donors, that will lead to a shift of power over time and a shift of listening and accountability. Those are my sort of initial thoughts. I think this is a great discussion. There's a lot to follow up here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Gareth.
Yeah, so just to follow in, a couple of points for me. So one is to link to that point about inflexibility. And as others have said, what we've heard on the workstream is that the donors have quite an enabling framework in place already. I think what's really missing is the confident leadership on the ground who feel able to go back to donors, really use it to change activities, change budget lines in response to what affected people are telling them. And as you said, Manisha, I think part of the reason for that is the power imbalance there, and that feels like a risky thing to do. I also noted Meg's point about communities wanting longer-term solutions and humanitarians being a bit limited in delivering these because of, for example, donor silos and mandates and things. And I'll come back to them in just a minute, but we do need to outline those mandate and resource issues to communities when you're having these conversations. And I can guarantee you, just from my own personal experience, that they'll be interested in engaging and they'll get it, and they'll understand, and they'll propose ideas and solutions. And you know, sometimes, I think also Kamar, I think it was noted in the chat that this really needs to be early on in the design phase. And the ideas that come out of those conversations won't always be workable, but some of them will be workable and others will lead to workable solutions and answers that we can deliver within our mandates and everything. So we need to kind of think of affected people as they're not just kind of, they are an asset there. They have brains, they have ideas, they know their realities, and they can understand our realities. So really just having those kind of imaginative leaders who can engage with them. And then in terms of our role as a work stream, I think part of our role as David and I have envisaged it is in terms of how do we connect those who've done it, because we know that it's happening, to those who are willing to give it a go and really encourage them. And I think all of us, including all the participants here, have a responsibility to be telling those stories, saying, look, you can do this. Actually, yeah, I did challenge my donor and they did change it. And then the other thing is that those kind of messages from high-level leaders like Samantha Powers, like Martin Griffiths, who can really support those on the front line to feel that the bigwigs are on their side. And that also links to David's point about asking. If frontline colleagues get used to being asked, then they will increasingly offer as well, and then increasingly kind of take those steps proactively. So yeah, so those are the key points for me. Thanks.
Super, thanks very much. And I think that point about leadership has come across all of our interventions today and all the points today. I think it's such a key role. And I think linked to that, and it's very telling that the IASC task force on AAP has in its, as its objective to contributing to greater system-wide change by strengthening AAP, in the theory of change, the first element is having a more accountable and enhanced leadership. But then it's also got, as part of that theory of change, that's supported by a more inclusive system and architecture, which then builds on existing AAP good practices and lessons and has access to more quality funding and technical resources. So I think all of the elements that all of you have raised are very much part of that theory of change. So it's the question of how do we get there in many ways. So Jesse and Tanya, I mean, and Frank, the other co-chair, because there's three of you co-chairing, Frank from the IFRC is in the audience. So Frank, please feel free to drop any thoughts as well into the chat. But, you know, the IAC principles in April this year said that affected people are always first responders. And so there's that acknowledgement of that. But the principles have committed to empowering, oh wait, no, I've jumped a question, sorry. My screen's too small and I've jumped far too ahead. Apologize for that. But I do think the theory of change reflects everything we've said. But, oh no, I'm not jumping. One second, I have to just make my piece of paper a little bit bigger. I apologize for that. So there we go. Jesse and Tanya, as two of the three co-chairs, what role do you see the task force contributing to the efforts on more collective AAP? And also, you know, in terms of building on those good practices that are out there, how do we really take that to the next level and have better collective AAP? Sorry about that.
No worries, Manisha. It happens to everybody, and it might even happen to me as I respond to your question. Let's see. Yeah, Tanya and I have sort of decided to split the questions a bit, but please feel free to come in, Tanya, afterwards if you feel like I have missed anything or there's a key remark to be made on this. But no, I think you hit the nail on the head, Manisha, and the previous presenters and a very rich discussion around some of the challenges we see to collective accountability to affected people, and the fact that we do need to get creative to work through them. The task force is really there, and the theory of change that you outlined is really as sort of like a North Star, I suppose, to help us all come together and agree on, you know, what does collective accountability mean in practice, and you know, how do we establish an enabling framework that supports country teams and those on the ground and affected communities themselves to engage and to actually realize the commitments that we've all made. And so, you know, the task force has put forward a work plan with a number of work streams that really looks at some of those key issues that were raised today. So how do we have empowered and accountable leadership? How do we push for a more inclusive humanitarian system which ensures the voices of affected people are heard at various levels of decision making? And how do we work with our donor, our funding partners, our resource partners to ensure that the resources are available and there's flexibility at the various levels that it's needed for an effective response? And of course, there's lots of challenges to that. And we really need to work through those at the local level. So just last week, in fact, I was with in person with the ISC in Ethiopia to support the humanitarian country team there, help them to develop a collective accountability action plan. And what really struck me was not only the broad buy-in by the various members of the HCT, and they have a unique HCT in that it's not just the UN or even donors, NGOs, but also a number of donors sit on that, as well as they've invited national NGOs. So you have a very inclusive representation. And what really sort of struck me was that while there are systemic challenges there, there's so much happening at the grassroots level, and this sort of creativity that we talk about. So we have, I think collectively, we put together a framework, a set of structures that can support collective accountability, but we really need, and of course there's obstacles, there's the silos and everything, but at the operational level, we need to sort of overcome some of these and identify gaps and find solutions. And I was really impressed to see in the various regions of Ethiopia that the partners are coming together to do just that. And it is a matter of sort of documenting those practices, elevating them, sharing them and learning from them, which perhaps may hold the key to enhancing some of our responses as we go forward. So I think the task force has a very central role, but it's certainly a partnership role. And we really need to look at that handshake, that relationship between this global dialogue and the country actions.
Super. Thanks very much, Jesse. Tony, did you want to come in on this one, or I'll cut? Great. Then I will come back to David and Gareth. I mean, you both said that you're looking a little bit more at greater participation of affected populations in the participation revolution workstream. What do you think can be done to more effectively bring voices of affected populations and communities to decision-making processes at the global level? And I think, Jesse, you gave a great example of how you've got local organizations in HCTs in Ethiopia, but how do we get some of those voices of affected people into the global level discussions?
Shall I go first, David, this time?
Yeah, go ahead, Gareth. I have some thoughts.
Yeah, so for me, I think this is often overcomplicated. It's really not rocket science. For me, it's simply about decision makers providing affected people with an understanding of the kind of decisions that we have to make, and then listening to affected people's thoughts on those, either directly when we, you know, as a lot of us do too infrequently, get to the front line, or through our frontline staff, our partner staff, and also through engaging with resources like Ground Truth and the HKI CHS audit findings as well. And my experience is that communities will enter into those debates with gusto. They do understand the kind of challenges that we face at the global policy level. They recognise that we have to, you know, convince not only donors, but more challengingly finance ministries and prime ministers' offices and those kind of things. And they've got ideas on it. So again, I think it's just for me about kind of recognize this isn't rocket science. It is stuff we can build in, but just because it's not rocket science doesn't mean it's easy. We have to kind of keep it front of mind and keep kind of pushing it. And then using the outcomes and recognizing that people are resources here, and that we can go and use that. But I think also there's a point there around making sure that, as you know, as I've discussed many times with Meg, is around making sure that we've got positive narratives there, right? So if we sit there and say, look, we're rubbish at this, then we struggle. If we say, actually, we're getting these challenges from affected communities and we think these might be some of the solutions, then we get a lot further and we're able to kind of move the whole discussion onwards. But David, over to you.
Yeah, I have only two sort of comments to make. One is I think we need to take advantage of the opportunities that we've seen in recent years, some of which have come up through the grand bargain to actually provide it's a cliche, but the seat at the table. And once the seat at the table is there, you know, the voices need to be listened to. And maybe I'm from New York, so maybe you just need some sharp elbows sometimes. And if you're at the table and no one's listening to you, yeah, you know, sort of like throw a plate or something, figuratively, you know, and say, you know, I'm here. You're not listening to me. I think we're at the stage now in which that kind of strong diplomacy, I don't mean rude, but strong diplomacy is needed. We also need, I think, to have greater communication between the donors, between the actors and the local voices. Within the grand bargain context, they are creating these national reference groups, and the work stream has prioritized engagement with them over the coming year as they are stood up, not in order to give them a preset agenda or to give them instructions, but to listen to what they have to say and to feed that back into the grand bargain discussions. So those national reference groups are important. But I also think within each of our donors, and we are trying to do this in my bureau and my organization, to insist that every time our staff in the field or our staff at headquarters are traveling, that they must meet with local actors. And that becomes a key aspect of our monitoring and evaluation. I think other donors are doing that, but if we can strengthen that, that will have an effect over the long term. But I can't emphasize enough, again, I'm from New York, that those sharp elbows sometimes are valuable. Thanks.
Sorry to come back in, Manisha, but one thing I do want to say, just like hearing this, and this is something that I've been thinking about for a long while, is one of the many kind of boring meetings, well, not boring, but one of the many meetings that I sit on is the ISC principles, and we know that Martin Griffiths, the ERC, has been very seized of AAP recently. So one of the things that I'm happy to commit to today is to go back to Martin and say, actually, how are we getting affected people's voice into our next ISC principles meeting? And see what we can work out, because I think we can do that. And as David is saying, I think we are more open to those voices in a way that we maybe weren't a few years ago. And, I'm sure Martin will be up for that. So I'll let you know how it goes. Thanks.
Thanks very much, David and Gareth. And there's a lot of conversation in the chat around some of the experience that refugee-led organizations have had of getting a seat at the table. And our seat in particular has been working with a number of governments to try to get refugees at the table. But I think we need to be cognizant that we need to make sure that we're involving not only refugees, but also internally displaced persons or affected communities, wherever they may be, even if they're not displaced, so that we're getting that range of voices at the table. And I think that's also particularly important, but I think we've got some great examples already to build upon with particularly the refugee-led community, of course, taking into consideration safety and security of those voices and making sure that we protect people as we're doing that as well. In terms of the ISC task force, I mean, Jesse, you talked about that theory of change being like a North Star. And, as Gareth, you just mentioned, the ISC principles had made a commitment to bringing in those voices of affected persons, including women, girls, and young people, to continuously and effectively shape humanitarian decision-making. And the principle said we must recognize, support, and engage them and the organizations they respect as equal partners. So Tanya and Jesse, that's a big kind of task for you as the ISC task force to really put into practice. So how are you going to support the principles to put that commitment into practice and encourage all the different organizations to work together to meaningfully include the voices of affected people in decision-making?
Great, thanks Manisha. So I'll take that one. Thanks Jesse for giving the space and bringing in the reality of your time in Ethiopia last week. It's good to get that kind of sense of where the ISC is really pushing at the country level. So to your question, Manisha, I think there's 3 areas that I would take it from, which really relates to that task force priorities, because I think what's great about this conversation is, and it's great to have the Grand Bargain connected to the task force, but it's great to hear kind of Meg's views coming in from really the fantastic work over 10 years of giving real space to the views of people affected. And then of course, Nanette coming in with some real tangibles of what this looks like. I think we're getting the AAP discussion into kind of really a system-wide discussion, away from just this kind of what happens at the field level, because it does need situating in that challenge to the sort of power dynamic. So for the task force, to your question, Manisha, there's 3 areas that we are going to be looking at. One is, and it's come out really clear today, it's inclusion, and it goes to that. David, you put it really well. It does keep going back to that, who's at the table, who has the power and the voice. Nanette, you reminded us of that really fantastic mantra, which should be our mantra of nothing about us without us. But we're actually not very good at doing it. We hear a lot about people are nervous of doing this. To your point, Gareth, it should just be the norm. It's not rocket science, but it doesn't happen. We sort of say, well, how are they going to connect in with this? Like you say, we've just got to try it. We've got to try and make sure that those voices are at the table, and also take away from this system perspective. This is about people and just that kind of humanity of having different voices at the table, different perspectives needs to be bought in, and we need to be constantly trying to challenge those power dynamics. So there is a point in the task force. We're not going to crack it in the short time that the task force has, but it's a really important discussion about who's in those system-wide approaches, but stretching ourselves further not just with which actors are at the table, but really how do we bring the voice of affected people to the decision making. So there's a commitment in this task force to looking at that, and I know many of you who are online now have some ideas about that, so we do want to hear those. Second one, leadership, and again this I think has come out really strong from all of you, but it is about not just being a field level activity, it is about that bold creative leadership. Meg referenced before the Humanitarian Accountability Report that was launched this morning. The Martin Griffiths, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, has done a really nice forward in there, responding to Gloria Soma from South Sudan. But one of the quotes that I like in it is he says, claiming to help without listening isn't in line with our principles. It's not just unaccountable, it's pushy and privileged. And I think this idea of sort of owning our pushiness and our privilege is, we need that. We need to be conscious of that, and we need to be able to make more space for others to be pushy and take that privilege. So there's some work that IOM are leading on about trying to make sure of what the leadership know about to be more accountable. And the final part of the work plan is on resourcing. And again, the sort of views of accountability, just bear with me for how the voice of affected people come into that, which is a really, what I thought was a fascinating discussion between Nanette and Meg, which was around this, trying to not separate accountability to affected people from the top-down accountability. We have to bring that together. We have to see our accountability as a system has to be based on the views of affected people, and there's many ways, through Ground Truths, through the CHS, through many of the work that organisations are doing, building on the voices of affected people, and that has to be what the donors are holding us to account on. This was why the core humanitarian standard was developed as a set of standards that we wanted the sector to hold us accountable to, not based on all this myriad of due diligence processes we're seeing, but some really fundamental ideas of commitments that are made to affected people by which we should all be held to account. So I think there's something there around not trying to separate out the two, but understanding that all of our work has to be based on those commitments to affected people, and we need to be held to account on those, and we can bring in the voice through that. So those are some of the 3 elements in the task force that we're going to be focusing on, all with trying to see how we amplify this voice of affected people through to the decision making.
Super. Thanks so much, Tanya. And I think, you know, that need for inclusion and how do we make sure we get those voices at the table and that we're listening to them is so critical. And there's been a number of comments in the chat as well as like, how do we make sure that we don't just have them participating, but we also have to think about that representation element, you know, because some people will have more time to engage with some of these decision-making processes. Others may not. So how do we make sure that representation role is there? I think that's a huge question always. I mean, even in any kind of politics, we get into political representation requires, you know, how much representation can you get on that? But there was also some elements in here, and fair point, there's a comment about not a single refugee was invited on the panel today. We do have practitioners today for sure, but we also don't have any affected population communities today per se. But the idea was very much to look at it from a practitioner point of view about where are we at the country level and looking at it more from a policy level, given the global conversations that are there. But the idea is that this is one of a series of conversations that we're going to be having. I don't know if anybody wants to have a last 30-second intervention based on what you've sort of heard from others, from anyone on the panel, because we've only got a few more minutes where I've got to wrap up. But I know there are a lot of comments in there. What we will do is take the responses from the Slido, which the last question around what's one action that can be taken forward, so that there's inputs for both the task force and the work stream of the Grand Bargain. But for the panelists, any last words in 30 seconds or less from any of you? Last thoughts, sorry.
Well, just to say the one action, so I've already tweeted and WhatsApp Martin, so we'll see what we can do. The next ISC Principles is in November, I think, so we'll try and put that into practice.
Great, Gareth.
It's already done.
Wonderful. Good action, right coming out of it. Meg, Nanette, David, Jesse, Tanya?
Yeah,
Nanette.
I just would like to say, thanks, Misha. Yeah, in response to this.
I can't hear you very well, Nanette.
Sorry.
Nanette, we can't hear you.
Oh my gosh. Hello?
Nope, still not. Maybe what, anyone else? A last word? Nanette, are you going to maybe type it into the chat? That would be great. Sorry about that. So let me just say huge thanks to all of you for both our panels. I think we had a really great sort of perspective from what is taking place in different countries, different operations, how we really are seeing that there's often a disconnect between what we think we're doing as practitioners and yet what people are saying as affected people. So really trying to find ways to better marry our expectations of affected people with how we're doing the work that we're needing to do. There's a broad recognition that we don't necessarily have a lot of the money that we need to do, but at the same time, as Nanette, you said, if we're really listening to affected people, putting their voices at the center of what we're doing from the beginning of planning until implementation and monitoring, we can actually become much more cost effective. We need to be looking at how we can become more flexible in our approaches. We've created a lot of systems, a lot of bureaucracy, but given the ways that creative leadership has been shown, we can overcome a lot of those systems and really kind of push ourselves beyond the boundaries outside of the box so that we're finding ways to get affected people's voices at the center of, at decision-making tables and at the center of what we're doing. That also requires that we're addressing these power dynamics that are existing between affected people, between local and national organizations, international organizations, and donors, and really seeing how can we mitigate those power imbalances so that we can have more honest conversations and make the necessary changes in programming so that we're really able to be much more effective and ensure that we are meeting the needs of people affected by crisis. That also requires trust. And I think that point, Nanette, that you made really about how do we get more trust amongst the donors, whether the big ones or big organizations. We need to make sure that we build on the good practices that are already there, create systems that are more accessible and friendly to affected people and local actors. We also need to be looking at how do we change mindsets. And I think that's something that we've seen come up not only today, but in previous conversations. It's really changing the way that we are approaching accountability. The fact, David, you said you had to ask, how is AAP being implemented? It's not prioritized often. As organizations, as leaders in organizations, how do we make sure that AAP is part and parcel of everything we do, that it's not just a checkbox exercise, as somebody had put it, but it's really how are we incorporating it from the beginning of our operations, and from the beginning of day one of a crisis and throughout. And looking at also how do we make sure, as Annette, you said, really, if we bring people in from the beginning, we are going to be better able to implement the nexus. So that excuse, Meg, that you said, or that reason, Meg, that you had said many identified is that, it's not a humanitarian job, but it's more of a development one, could be very easily sort of taken forward by really just putting people at the center and finding ways to ensure that we're doing that. So I think we've heard a lot of great work that's going on. We really need to be highlighting those great examples that are out there, but then also then taking that through not only the Grand Bargain Participation Revolution workstream and the national reference groups that are being created, but through the work of the ISC Task Force on AAP. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a second conversation that the task force is having, and we will be having further conversations. So I think it's really taking a lot of what you will have also identified as those actions. How do we take those forward and really building on a lot of the suggestions in the comment boxes, looking at sort of the experience of the refugee-led organizations in different government bodies and how they've gotten better representation, looking at some of the past examples and good work that's done elsewhere, and really looking at how can we collectively work together, because I think there's a lot of what we need to do. So it's how do we move together on that? And I think we've really continued the conversation. So huge thanks to everyone on the panel. Really appreciate it. Also to our interpreters everyone in the audience for all of your engagement. And Tanya, I'm going to pass back to you. And also to MYT, sorry. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you so much, Manisha, and thank you to all the panelists. Thanks to Jess and Frank as well. Thanks, Frank, for being with us. Again, just this conversation needs to keep being crescendoed. The task force is committed to continuing this conversation. So it was excellent to do it. Really great, David and Gareth. We were able to join forces with you today in that. And to the point that this was one of the conversations over the next few days for the exchange. And this one was about the global policy arena. So to the point about, I know we haven't quite got the practitioners and the people that we wanted really in this debate, but we did want to position this as a global policy discussion. So thank you, Manisha, as well as ever, for guiding us through this great conversation. And I'll pass back now over to Faye. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the great tips and discussion going on in the chat as well. Faye, over to you. Thank you, everyone.